Hello everyone, welcome back to another lecture and another week. It's hard to believe we've only got 2 full weeks plus 1 day left of the class already, but that's just how quickly these things move in the summer. So without further ado, let me just jump straight into the lecture. One quick thing I will say is that I posted the final essay instructions as well. Take a look at those. I suppose I can make a video about them if it's desired, but I'm not sure if it's really necessary. If you've got questions about that final essay, feel free to contact me. Hopefully nothing in there should be too much of a big surprise. So the reading for this piece comes from Paul Edwards, another sort of emigre from 1930s Europe. So he was born in Austria, but ended up in Australia and then eventually New York. Notable for being the editor of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I've got a set of those volumes on a bookshelf in my office on campus. Wound up being about 4,000 pages, and this was written back in the, I think it was 60s, 70s, if I'm getting the decades on it correct. Really ranging on everything in philosophy. It came in 8 volumes. And in fact, this piece itself was put into that encyclopedia. So that's an interesting little tidbit. Okay, so let's just get right into what Edwards wants to do. And as we're going to see, really what Edwards is doing in this piece is really trying to offer a response to pessimists like Schopenhauer. Edwards also includes in that the list of pessimists Tolstoy. So what he wants to do in the piece is to really examine these pessimistic views. Ultimately, he's going to argue that the standards used in those pessimistic views are just inappropriate. That really, we ought to give up on the standards that say that all our lives are meaningless unless certain very exceptional conditions are met. Ultimately, Edwards concludes that judgments about whether or not life is worthwhile or valuable is really a matter of preference more than anything. So it's not really a matter of something objective that we could be right or wrong about. Really, it's a question about how we feel. And on a positive note, so a lot of what he's doing in this piece is critical, sort of looking at what the pessimists like Schopenhauer and Tolstoy say and then providing arguments why they're incorrect. Edwards does ultimately want to conclude that human lives can be meaningful, irrespective of the existence of God or an afterlife. So he thinks even if we give up on believing in God, even if we don't have an afterlife, and I suppose I should even be more careful there, because we can talk about whether or not God exists and there is an afterlife, a personal immortal afterlife, and then there are the questions about what we believe, right? God can exist and we believe God exists, or God exists and we don't believe, just like a personal afterlife can exist and we either believe it exists or not. So the question of belief and how things really are, right, are really 2 separate things. But ultimately, Edwards thinks even if the secular scientific worldview is correct, that one we were talking about with Bayer and Russell, our lives can still be meaningful, though are not necessarily meaningful. So really, it opens this door to saying, well, look, maybe some lives are meaningful and other lives aren't meaningful. So we'll hear a little bit about the conditions under which Edwards thinks that's the case. And this is going to be, in some sense, really setting the tone for the rest of the course. In the rest of the course, largely what we're going to be looking at are non-theistic views, so really non-religious views, so views really put within the secular scientific worldviews, generally speaking. Some of them we're going to see next day. Klemke has a piece where he's going to be somewhat hostile towards theism and religion generally. Hopefully not too hostile, but he certainly wants to put some distance there. And then we're going to look at some other pieces. So we're going to look at the absurd, we're going to look at some subjective views and some other views near the end, which are not going to be relying on immortality or the existence of God for questions of settling questions of meaning, but rather instead are going to be relying on other things such as our attitudes and our beliefs and our actions and so on. and we're going to see in a lot of those views, it's really going to be a question of under what sorts of conditions might we say that lives have meaning, at least certain lives, rather than what's the condition for all lives really having. So that's just where we're headed. Okay, so just jumping into it here, Edwards really opens up and starts really characterizing the view of the pessimists, that they've really rejected the claims of religion. And so one thing I'll note here, just to avoid confusion right at the outset, when Edwards is talking about Tolstoy, he's really talking about pre-conversion Tolstoy. Tolstoy, before he has his religious awakening and realizes that his life can have meaning with his connection to the infinite. We're really thinking here the secular Tolstoy, the one who opens the piece, who says, you know, I had a famous literary career, I was well-to-do, I had money and a nice family, and everything seemed to be going well in my life, but I was having this big problem. It's that Tolstoy that Edwards thinks is pessimistic, and arguably even the Tolstoy after his conversion or awakening. Even that Tolstoy might be pessimistic in some sense. So Edwards is really focusing on pessimists who are atheistic, or at least have rejected the claims of traditional religion. And from there, they conclude that life is not worthwhile and that it is devoid of meaning. However, the pessimists are presenting their view not just as their own particular take on things. It's not just their own personal, subjective, perhaps idiosyncratic view that life is no longer worth living if those traditional claims of religion are rejected, but instead they present their views as in some sense objectively warranted. That is, something to be regarded as true by everyone, really trying to present their views as conclusions well supported by reasons, right? Reasons that everybody could share in. Edwards frames his own task as really this: our question will be whether the pessimistic conclusions are justified if belief in God and immortality are rejected. So thinking in terms of what assumptions is Edwards relying on, he does us a wonderful favor right at the outset of the piece. It's right within the first couple of pages, I believe. He just says, look, so what we're not doing in this piece is arguing about whether or not God exists and whether or not we will have immortal lives and so on. We're just assuming, we're just going to reject those. We're just saying, okay, assuming, as the pessimists do, that those claims are false, you know, that is the claims being, you know, that God exists and we have an immortal life waiting for us after our earthly life. Can life be worthwhile? Are the pessimistic conclusions really justified? Do we have good reason to believe them if we've given up on these particular religious claims? Edwards, sorry about this, starts by examining Schopenhauer, and ultimately he concludes that Schopenhauer's view isn't really plausible. He agrees that Schopenhauer really puts his finger on a lot of important points, and a lot of what Schopenhauer says is true in terms of drawing our attention to the inevitable suffering and misery that life sometimes brings us. But ultimately, Edwards thinks Schopenhauer's just really overstated the case. He's really just overblown how much suffering and pain and misery life has compared to how much pleasure and joy and happiness and so on can have. So this doctrine that we heard in Schopenhauer last week, that happiness or pleasure is really a kind of absence or negation, that what's real is pain and happiness and misery, that pleasure, happiness, satisfaction, and so on are really just lacking certain things. Edwards says, look, this is just glaringly false. Edwards says this, which I just love. He says, some of Schopenhauer's arguments can probably be dismissed as the fantasies of a lonely and embittered man who was filled with contempt for mankind and who was singularly incapable of either love or friendship. Which is, it's just sort of a lovely summary of Schopenhauer's temperament to some degree. Now, of course, there's always this question here. to what degree are the characteristics of a thinker really relevant to what they're saying? So, and it's a debatable issue, because on the one hand, we can look at what people say and what they think, and we can see that as being motivated in a certain way by who they are and their situation, their position, and so on, which does seem relevant, at least to the extent of explaining why they think the way they do. But if we're asking questions of justification, right, are they correct or not? In some sense, we have to disregard those other factors, the explanation. Well, why did they think that way? Right? So why did Schopenhauer think the way he did? Well, look, maybe it was a result of his own psychological dispositions, his time and place, the way his life went, and so on. Maybe for him there was really something to this. But if we're trying to generalize this to humans, across the board, if we make this a universal claim, then we've got to ask this question: are we really justified in believing what Schopenhauer said? And effectively, really, what Edwards is doing here is just saying, look, no, right? If this is meant to be a claim about all humans, it seems glaringly false. Why? Well, at least I, Paul Edwards, don't experience happiness or pleasure that way. And I have to say, Carl Latter, also don't experience it that way. Anybody who says that happiness or pleasure is really just an utter absence of pain or suffering or whatever we might call it, that just doesn't seem to match my own experience. I don't know about you, and this is where some interesting conversation can happen in terms of how we actually experience some of these things, because maybe there really are differences amongst people. We quite often universalize from our own particular experience of the world and assume everybody else has a very similar sort of experience. But of course, as we've gotten better and started asking more interesting questions, and fields like psychology have gotten better and better, we start to discover that not everybody experiences all things the same way. So there's some really interesting questions around to what extent Schopenhauer might be right, but if it's supposed to be universal, it seems like he's just wrong. And so Edwards is trying to offer a little bit of an explanation here, plus get in a little bit of a zinger. Now, other thinkers, such as Clarence Darrow, Tolstoy. Clarence Darrow is a famous American lawyer, 20th century American lawyer, maybe 19th, 20th century. Interesting character to look up if you don't know anything about him. Other thinkers have endorsed similar conclusions to Schopenhauer. And Edwards admits, he says, well, look, we can't just chalk up everything pessimists have come up with to their personalities. That seems a little too hasty. It seems like an easy way to try to explain it away. So we need to really try to take these claims on their merits. We can't just point to idiosyncratic personality flaws and say, oh, well, don't even take the pessimists seriously. He says, let's try to take them seriously. What kind of rational force do their arguments have? How strong are their cases? Edwards says there are some strengths. There are some things we have to admit the pessimists are getting right. But really, at the end of the analysis, Edwards says there are mistakes, there are missteps that get made by the pessimists that once we diagnose and we see those mistakes, we aren't forced into accepting their conclusions, which is not to say that their views are completely wrong-headed. So for instance, just before we get into all the particular points Edwards actually looks at, he admits that life does contain a significant amount of unhappiness. Joy is often fleeting, unpredictable events can cause great sorrow, we're all bound to die, and it seems that eventually our entire species will die out, as Russell has drawn our attention to, as well as some others. Despite those facts, despite the fact that it seems inevitable that human life is going to contain some pain and suffering, in fact, it may contain a lot of pain and suffering, right? There's no guarantee that on balance, any given human life is going to have more happiness than sadness or more pleasure than pain. Despite that, Edwards thinks we are not forced to accept the conclusions of the pessimists, and ultimately, if those conclusions or those views are being put forward as objectively warranted and are being put forward as universal, then we can conclude that in fact what the pessimists are arguing for is false. So the various points here, so on the slides as we go through them. I've tried to mark them off just with the various points that he talks about. Edwards has a lovely summary right at the end of the piece of really what he talked about, really the conclusions that the piece draws. So really the ultimate conclusion is that the pessimists are wrong, right? That's, in a nutshell, that's really what Edwards is arguing here. But he's got 6 conclusions that he ultimately draws from it, and that's what we're really going to work through here, the case for those various conclusions. So first, this assertion that death is better than life and that death makes life worthless in some sense, because we will all eventually die. This is really what the pessimists are trying to draw attention to. Now, pessimists assert that death is better than life in some sense. But for death to be something good, Edwards thinks, given that death is an end, that's really what it is. And he's working with the view of death Nagel is working with here, really death, sort of the end of existence, no more consciousness, no more experience. Again, he's given up on any notion of immortality, at least for the sake of this piece. If death is an end, it can only be a good thing if it's terminating, or it can only be a bad thing if it's terminating something good, right? So it's good when a bad thing ends, and it's bad when a good thing ends, at least generally speaking, right? And of course, we can ask these questions about whether or not things, would life be worth living if it were immortal? We can think about Williams and Fisher and so on. But that's not really what Edwards is trying to engage with here. Rather, he's just looking at this, thinking about the logic of it. If death is the end of something, then it's really a question of whether or not it was good that the thing ended. It's good when bad things end, and it's bad when good things end. So, if death is bad, right, that must be because it's terminating something good, namely life, right? So Edwards says it's really not clear how pessimists can consistently maintain that death is better than life, but also conclude that death is somehow a bad thing. So as he puts it in one spot, death is something terrible because it terminates the possibility of having any of the experiences we value. Pessimists conclude that really because we die, it's not worth doing anything at all. So Edwards thinks there's some confusion on the side of the pessimists about the status of death. Now, it can be held that life becomes worthless once we realize that we die. So it's not death itself that makes life worthless. Rather, it's our own realization that we are eventually going to die that makes life not worth living anymore. But Edwards thinks that here again, this is not a typical reaction, nor is it a warranted reaction. Edwards says this, he says, there's a very simple reply to this argument. Granting that some people, after once realizing their doom, cannot banish the thought of it from their minds, so much so that it interferes with all of their other activities. This is neither inevitable nor at all common. It is, on the contrary, in the opinion of all except some existentialists, morbid and pathological. So Edwards says, sure, right? Once we realize that we're mortal and that eventually we're going to die and all the things we do are going to come to an end, right? Think of Tolstoy here. He says, well, yeah, that, right? It's not unsurprising to some degree that we go through that, right? Especially as a, say as a child, once you realize the fact of mortality and so on. It's something you get fixated on fairly easy and get very sad about. But we typically sort of come out of it. We come to accept that fact and we can move on. And being fixated on it and allowing that to interfere with and completely distract us from all of the other activities in our life is really problematic. It's unusual and problematic. It's not a justified reaction. It's not a typical reaction. That reaction itself is highly problematic, but that seems like something to try to work through or solve rather than acknowledge as really being some deep truth. Now, on the third point, so not only does Edwards think there is some confusion on the part of the pessimists about how they compare death and life, right? And they think that in some sense death is better than life, or they regard death as a some kind of bad thing because it terminates something good. This whole evaluation of death and comparing it to life, Edwards thinks, is really wrong-headed and mistaken. Given what death is, that it's an end of conscious existence, in principle, we can't check it out, right? We can't inspect it. We can't have experience of it. We can't go see what death is like and come back to normal life and right, determine which one's better or worse. Death is really a kind of non-existence. Now, Edwards thinks when we try to compare the value of two things, determining which one's better than the other one, really we can only do that when both objects of comparison are in principle open to inspection, right? If there's no afterlife, as Edwards puts it, death is not a possible object of observation or experience. So look, if we're trying to compare two restaurants, say, right, which one's better? Or any of two experiences, two or more beaches or films or whatever. We're only likely going to take people's accounts or views on which thing is better than the other seriously if they've actually had some kind of experience of both. But if death is just non-existence, then when the pessimists are talking about death being somehow better than life, Edwards says, it's just really not clear what they're saying here. There's no way that their judgment on this matter could really be objectively warranted. They don't have good evidence for it. They can't point to any experience of it. So if they're putting forward this claim as being objectively correct, that is something that's not just the expression of certain feelings or moods or our own particular subjective point of view on things, Edwards says they really don't have a leg to stand on here, ultimately, because you can't go see what death is like and then compare it with life and make an assessment of which one is better, right, or more valuable. Okay, so much for this first claim. Second, the preference for the future. Edwards notes that in writers like Tolstoy, Darrow, even perhaps Schopenhauer, there is this curious and totally arbitrary preference of the future to the present, right? So for instance, with Tolstoy, he thinks that life would be worthwhile if the present life were followed by eternal bliss, right? And if you don't have eternal bliss afterwards, you don't have that connection with the infinite and so on, then everything now becomes meaningless, right? If it doesn't carry on to the future, it can't matter now or be meaningful now. But Edwards says we can always call these future ends into question as well. So it's really unclear why we ought to prefer the future to the present. So when talking about Tolstoy, Edwards points out that Tolstoy himself doesn't seem to question the point of bliss in the next life, in the afterlife. And so Edwards comments, but if bliss in the next life is not in need of any further justification, why should any bliss that there might be in the present life need justification? So there seems to be this odd preference for the future that doesn't itself really seem to be justified. And ultimately, what Edwards is really trying to draw attention to is that it's just not clear how something now loses its value or meaning if at some later point it's no longer present or occurring or whatnot. So this preference for the future is really arbitrary. There aren't good reasons to have it. Of course, one might be fixated on the future, right? One might feel like Tolstoy, that unless it goes on forever, there's no point to it. But here again, just like with the attitude towards death, Edwards ultimately thinks there's a good reason to have that view, right? One might have it, sure, but there's not a good reason to adopt it. Third, the logic of value judgments. There's a confusion between intrinsic and instrumental value, Edwards thinks, that really cuts through a lot of the things the pessimists say. So we've talked about this distinction before. So if something's intrinsically valuable, it's really valuable in and of itself. It's not, not valuable because of what it gets you. When things are instrumentally valuable, that's precisely how they're valuable. They're valuable because they get you some other thing that's valuable. They are not in and of themselves of value. And so look, just another example of intrinsic versus instrumental value. If you're taking a trip for the sake of the trip, you just want to enjoy the trip itself, that sounds like something that's intrinsically valuable, taking the trip. But if you take the trip only because of some further good you want to get, then it sounds like the trip itself is of instrumental value. So look, if, say your family lives far away or something, you want to go visit them, but it's going to take you a couple of days to drive there. You wouldn't drive there unless your family's there. You don't enjoy the drive itself. If you could skip it, you would. Then the drive is of instrumental value, right? But if you really like driving, you enjoy the trip and so on, you would take the trip just for its own sake, right? Then it would be of intrinsic value. So with this distinction in our pocket, what's Edwards' point here? Well, when the pessimists are making claims of value, it seems to be really what they seem to be doing is calling into question the value of many things. So we could see this in Tolstoy, we could see this certainly to some degree in Schopenhauer. They really question whether or not life is worthwhile, right? Is it worth being alive? Is it worth doing anything? I think Tolstoy is a good example of this, right? Is it really worth writing another book or raising my family or looking after my property or whatever it is, right? What makes it worth doing? What's the point of it? Right? Edwards admits it makes perfect sense to question whether or not something that's instrumentally valuable is worthwhile, right? Is it really worth taking that trip if you don't get the thing you want out of it or whatever it might be, right? Is it really worth driving 2 days to visit your family only to find out when you get there they've gone on a trip themselves and won't be back for weeks, right? You're trying to go for a surprise visit. You might show up and say, that drive wasn't worth it, right? I wouldn't have come if I'd known they weren't going to be here. So Edwards thinks, we can certainly do that. He gives a different example, driving to a beach, right? If you drive to a beach, turns out it's on a very busy day, and once you get there, you realize how busy it is, and you're not really going to enjoy it. You might certainly say, well, it really wasn't worth the time, right? But Edwards thinks it doesn't make sense to question the worthwhileness of things we find intrinsically valuable, right? So look, if you enjoy, playing games, or reading books, or watching shows, or whatever it is, right? If it's something you enjoy doing, you find it intrinsically valuable. On its own, it doesn't really make sense to question whether it's worth doing, right? Edwards thinks, really, when we ask whether or not something's worth doing, generally speaking, what we're really asking for is whether or not it was intrinsically valuable. And if it's not, was it worth the effort for whatever of intrinsic value it eventually got you? Right? So it doesn't really make sense to ask about the worthwhileness of things we find intrinsically valuable unless we're evaluating trade-offs, right? If there are two or more things of intrinsic value or things that we regard as being intrinsically valuable, but we can't have both to the same degree, some kind of trade-off is required, right? Say we find time with family and friends intrinsically valuable. We also find a rewarding career intrinsically valuable. But we realize there's some trade-off between the two, that to have the rewarding career we want, let's say, we're going to have less time with friends and family than we would otherwise like. There's a real question there in terms of, is it worth giving up this much of one thing for that much of the other, right? We can have that kind of trade-off. But ultimately, Edwards thinks, and this really comes back to this previous point, even if the thing of intrinsic value eventually ends, right? Eventually the intrinsically valuable career ends, eventually those relationships with other people end because they die and we die. It still makes sense to pursue things that are intrinsically valuable, enjoy them, right? To keep valuing them, even if at some time in the future they're not going to be valuable and they're not going to exist. Edwards says, okay, that's fine, but we don't need to take up that position of regarding how things are evaluated in the future as determining how they're really evaluated, right? Sure, in a million years I'm going to be dead and my friends and family won't be alive. but it's not a million years from now, is it? Right? So I don't see why I need to be fixated on what will eventually be the case rather than what is the case right now. So with this whole view, right, once we come to recognize that we can be focusing on the present or near future, right, our lives as we're living them and what we can reasonably expect to be coming in the not too distant future, right, not a million years from now, but perhaps years from now. Once we recognize that, and once we sort of get our head straight in terms of what makes sense to ask questions about in terms of worthwhileness, right, that it's really only things that are instrumentally valuable or trade-offs between things of intrinsic value. Those make sense to ask whether or not the trade-off was worth it or whether the effort was worth it. But just asking whether or not it's really worth engaging with things that are intrinsically valuable themselves, that doesn't really make sense, Edwards thinks. And here again, we can think about Tolstoy. Perhaps once he came to realize that he was going to die and everybody he knew and cared about was going to die and so on, he failed to regard anything as intrinsically valuable. That really tells us about Tolstoy's own reaction. That doesn't give us a reason to think Tolstoy was right. Again, it's this question about, is Tolstoy just telling us what he thinks or what he thought and what he felt, right? Because that's one thing. That's sort of like a journal or an expression of here's how I, Leo Tolstoy, feel once I realize this thing. But that's not, it doesn't seem to be what Tolstoy is really doing. And this is exactly what Edwards is getting at. What Tolstoy seems to be doing is telling us this is how it really is, right? I've realized this truth. You should regard things the same way that I do. But there's this question, why? For what reason? Right? What makes Tolstoy's view the right one rather than a particular view one could take up and one that's not particularly healthy or productive, Edwards thinks. Okay. 4, the importance of the past. And so this again connects with that second point about the preference for the future. So this is a little bit more particularly about Schopenhauer's view, but it extends to some other pessimistic views as well. So Schopenhauer held that something of great importance now past is inferior to something of little importance now present. So Schopenhauer thought really only the present is real. You know, in some sense, the past really doesn't exist and the future doesn't exist. So the present is real. And so whatever now exists, even if it's of very little value or importance, really exists. Once something ceases to exist, once it's past, no matter how important it was, as soon as it's gone, it's basically just nothing. It doesn't matter anymore. Now, Edwards has a couple of points about this. So Schopenhauer was trying to take this to say, you know, it doesn't matter how pleasurable or important something was. Once it's gone, it ceases to be of value. It ceases to matter, and so on. So all you're left with is your current pain and struggle and aiming towards goals and objectives. And once you reach that, well, it doesn't really matter anymore. And you might be satisfied for a short amount of time, and you get back on the hamster wheel of existence. And again, you're pursuing some purpose and so on and so forth. Edwards says, well, you know, hold on a minute. First, Schopenhauer, we need to note one thing, which is that if this is true, that, you know, it doesn't matter how important something was, once it's in the past, it doesn't really matter anymore. That means that all of our pain and suffering, once it's in the past, also doesn't matter. Nothing in the past matters, right? You don't get to have your cake and eat it too. You can't say, oh, all good things, once they're in the past, cease to be of value, but bad things remain bad, right? No, if the past doesn't exist, then even pain and suffering and disappointment and so on really ceases to matter once it's no longer real by not being in the present. Secondly, this, like so many of the other points that Edwards is identifying in the pessimists, Edwards thinks that this view that really, once things are in the past, they're not important or valuable anymore, he says this really seems like just a particular view. This is a way that we could evaluate things. We might regard things quite differently. We might think that things in the past are very important or valuable. We might think in a positive way. ultimately, Edwards thinks none of these views can really be said to be mistaken. It's really not clear whether or not the past matters in any objective sense. This again seems like really a matter of subjective preference, Edwards thinks, right? As an individual, Schopenhauer may have thought once something's in the past, it doesn't matter. Or once a good thing or an important thing is in the past, it doesn't matter. But maybe bad things continue to be bad, or sources of pain, right? And here again, we can think about this in terms of psychology and what individuals are like and how they experience their own thoughts and lives, right? So we can just imagine, I don't have any facts or studies or anything for this, but we can easily imagine different sorts of people. Some people who, as soon as things are past, right? Well, we can think of people who could have really no ability to form memories, right? Or at least any new memories. For those people, once something is past, it's just literally gone, they don't remember it. We can think about people who are able to form memories but attach no importance at all to anything they can remember, right? And who actually do not participate in the activity of remembering very much, right? Because remembering, working through memories, that's to some degree at least an active process. And if you occupy your conscious attention with other things, you can just not do that, right? Just don't look through old pictures. Don't think about old memories, right? Once something's gone, that's it. It's just in the trash bin of history. Move on, right? We can think of people who utterly fixate on the past. We can think of people who will take a selective approach to the past. Some people may focus on positive memories. Some people may focus on negative memories. Some people will dwell on their successes. Others may dwell on their failures or disappointments, right? And this is really what Edwards is getting at. There are different ways we can have a relationship with the past, different ways we can regard it. None of them can really be said to be mistaken, because this just doesn't seem like the kind of issue on which somebody can really be right or wrong. These are like attitudes towards something, right? Not mathematical proofs. So here again, when it comes to the issue of the importance of the past, pessimists seem to, one, be inconsistent in a self-serving way quite often, and two, once we sort of try to work out that inconsistency and then really try to determine whether or not there's good reason to regard their view as true, right? That is a view that other people should also hold, assuming they're rational agents. Edwards says it's really not clear what reasons, if any, the pessimists have in favor of their position. Right? It seems like they have a particular view or attitude which they then project outwards and assume other people should take up. All right, on to different senses of meaning. Now, Edwards actually, so one nice part about the Edwards piece being here in the course is that Edwards actually talks about a lot of people we've looked at. So we've looked at Schopenhauer, we've looked at Tolstoy, we've looked at Bayer. There might even be, he talks about Russell. There might even be one or two more people he talks about in the course that I'm forgetting here. He talks about Bayer. In fact, he talks some here about the part of Bayer's piece, The Meaning of Life, that I didn't ask you to read. And a part why I didn't ask you to read that is because I know that Edwards talks about it here and goes over some of that same ground fairly succinctly. So I figured it was easier just to get it here out of Edwards in a page or two than ask you to read more Bayer. So there's this distinction Bayer makes in the remainder of this piece between two senses of meaning or significance that Edwards wants to make use of. There's cosmic meaning and terrestrial meaning. So cosmic meaning is that kind imbued by some kind of superhuman intelligence. As Edwards puts it, we have cosmic meaning if there is a superhuman intelligence that fashioned human beings along with other objects in the world to serve some end. Here again, think about Nozick, think about God's plan, just some of the comments he makes about that. Let's just for the moment, we'll assume God exists, God created everything, God also created humans for some kind of purpose, right? We serve some kind of role. That would give us cosmic meaning, right? As Edwards and Bayer use that term. Now, there's terrestrial meaning. Terrestrial, of course, just of or relating to the earth, right? Being here. Terrestrial meaning is found in a person's life, and this is a separate kind of meaning from cosmic meaning. So terrestrial meaning is found in a person's life if, one, they have some dominant overall goal or goals, which give direction to a great many of the individual's actions. This is Edwards here. And secondly, these actions and possibly others not immediately related to the overriding goal or performed with a special zest that was not present before the person became attached to his goal, or that would not have been present if there had been no such goal in his life. So, and here again, we could also think about Quinn, when Quinn's talking about teleological meaning, right? Very similar kind of analysis here, right? That there's some kind of goals that we're working towards, and that activity of working towards the goal or set of goals really gives us a kind of motivation, a kind of incentive, gives us kind of zest or vim and vigor that we would otherwise be lacking, right? Because we can think of somebody who just kind of like goes through life and it's just this sort of big chore versus someone who looks forward to it, is excited by it, is motivated to try to reach something. So terrestrial meaning is separate from cosmic meaning. Terrestrial meaning is really more individual and subjective as well, right? So Edwards thinks once we realize this distinction of Bayer's, we can recognize that somebody can have a meaningful life, at least in some regard, even if there isn't cosmic meaning, right? But they will require some attachment that are not too shallow. Now, Edwards himself says it's a little open-ended, it's a little vague exactly what that means, but that in some sense is intentional. So if God doesn't exist, we can't have cosmic meaning, right? Though even if God existed and had cosmic meaning, that might not provide us with terrestrial meaning. And so here again, we can think about Nozick. Even if God exists and has a plan for us, we know what the plan is, we might not be that interested in our position in the plan. And so Edwards thinks, really we can have cosmic or terrestrial meaning independently of one another. And he says, in fact, if we look at religious people, we look at theists, he says, it's fairly clear that even for the most part, at least, theists don't think the only kind of meaning we can have is cosmic meaning, right? That seems to be one kind of meaning, right? Now, of course, one that's regarded as being quite important by a lot of people, right? But, and this is really Bayer's point, he says, it's not like all theists just sort of give up on the world and don't engage in any plans or projects or anything worthwhile here, right? And it seems like, at least he claims, that when we have theists that have both, right, believe they have cosmic meaning, but then also have a terrestrial meaning, they're engaged in curing cancer or whatever it is, making the world a better place in some sense, that even those theists can regard their terrestrial projects as being worth doing independently of their cosmic meaning, right? Independent of their role in God's plan and the fact that God exists and so on. So Edwards thinks there's really these two different kinds of meaning that we could have or lack independently of one another, right? Cosmic meaning and terrestrial meaning. If we lack cosmic meaning, which he's just assuming here, right? Again, he's just assuming this piece, we lack cosmic meaning. We might, like Tolstoy, then just feel like we can't have terrestrial meaning anymore, right? It might just be somehow psychologically impossible for us to have that. But Edwards claims that's not obviously the case. And in fact, many non-theists think they have terrestrial meaning, even though they don't have cosmic meaning. And there are others, right, theists, who think they have cosmic meaning and terrestrial meaning, but the terrestrial meaning seems separate from the cosmic meaning. Right? Last comment on this. There's a few other things I was thinking about saying, but I'll try to keep things fairly succinct. If we're thinking about what makes for a meaningful life, of course, we can, again, think like Quinn and think in terms of complete meaning, right? And of course, Quinn there was talking about axiological and teleological meaning. Here, Edwards is really talking about two different kinds of meaning that these both seem like kinds of teleological meaning. right? Cosmic and terrestrial meaning seem to be varieties of teleological meaning in his sense. What Edwards is getting at is that it seems sufficient for a life to be meaningful that it has just even one of these, right? That it has terrestrial meaning seems sufficient to make a life meaningful. You don't need both cosmic and terrestrial meaning as a sufficient condition for life being meaningful. Okay. The sixth point, is human life ever worthwhile? Here, Edwards wants to distinguish between two different senses of worthwhile. So part of what Edwards is doing in this piece is just some good philosophy, taking things like meaning and senses of worthwhile and trying to distinguish between different closely related senses that we can still tease out through analysis. And then once we've teased them out, once we've separated them, we can then use those categories of analysis to get more precise and more specific about what it is we're talking about. All right, so whether or not, right, you like the Edwards piece overall, whether or not I agree with the Edwards piece, I do think it serves as a good model of what philosophy can and ultimately should be like, at least to some extent, given his attention to fine detail. Okay, so we've got these two senses of worthwhile. Now, he tells us when we say that someone's life is worthwhile, we're claiming that the person has some goals which do not seem to him to be trivial, and that there's some genuine possibility that he will attain these goals. So Edwards is very goal or project-based when he's thinking about the meaning of life. This is something we're going to see, especially when we come to Taylor later in the course. Not that much later, we don't have too much of the course left, but we still have a little while. We're going to see we don't necessarily have to be fixated on projects and purposes and plans and goals. Not necessarily, but we'll save that for later. I'm just flagging it here. This is something Edwards is still very much buying into or is still broadly characterizing his approach to this question. So we're talking about worthwhile. This is really what we're talking about, that somebody has goals that they think really are attainable. They don't think they're trivial, right? They're really worth pursuing. They can be attained to some degree. Edwards thinks this is really what makes a life subjectively worthwhile, right? So worthwhile for the individual, that they have goals, right, that they think are non-trivial and attainable, but that doesn't tell us anything about anything about really the moral status of those goals. So a life can be objectively worthwhile. So we can take the same life and try to analyze it two different ways. And when we're asking whether a life was worthwhile, we can say, well, is it subjectively worthwhile? That's really a question about the person's attitudes, right, towards their own goals and projects or so on. The question of whether or not it's objectively worthwhile is really a question that introduces questions of morality, questions of value. Life is objectively worthwhile when it is attached to certain goals which are both attainable and of positive value. Right? Goals that can be reached and goals that are actually worth reaching, right? That it would be a good thing to have reached. So on this point, Edwards says, we can judge the worthwhileness of lives, and that might in some sense seem impolite, but why should politeness stand in our way of doing something correct? So here again, we can have these two senses of worthwhile can come apart. So a single human life might be neither subjectively nor objectively worthwhile. It might be both, and it might be one without the other, right? On either way. So really, it's that moral dimension that really makes the difference. So it's subjectively worthwhile if really the person is motivated to accomplish it in some sense, right? This sort of psychological attachment, so on. Whether or not they're objectively worthwhile is really a question of, is the world a better place as a result of that life? So Edwards talks about Adolf Eichmann, famous Nazi bureaucrat who, basically a high-level functionary within the Nazi regime, was very important and instrumental in orchestrating the Holocaust, really on the logistical side. So he, sort of made sure all the trains ran on time to Auschwitz. Was his life worthwhile? Edwards says, well, look, we can distinguish between these things. So it was subjectively worthwhile if Eichmann himself thought that, making sure the trains ran on time to Auschwitz wasn't trivial, right? It was something that was in some sense important, and that it was something that was achievable. It was something attainable. It could be done. Right? He was motivated to do it. So perhaps Eichmann's life was subjectively worthwhile, right? He thought it was really worth doing that. But of course, was it objectively worthwhile? Is the world a better place for Eichmann having lived his life and served that function or tried to attain that goal? Well, no, probably not, right? It probably would have been better to have nobody doing that. Or if there was somebody doing it, an absolute, right, incompetent fool doing it who screwed everything up and made the process as inefficient as possible, because that would have saved lives, right? So we can evaluate the worthwhileness of lives by using this kind of distinction, but separating them out helps us be sensitive to more features of worthwhileness than just sort of clumping them all together. Okay. Now, coming around to Pessimists' special standards, this is in some way a little bit of a summary of a few of the other points that have already been made, but goes past it a little bit as well. So the pessimists have these peculiarly high standards or special standards. They judge the value of things by whether they're really or ultimately or finally worth doing or valuable or what have you. Here again, that preference for the future tends to kick in. Depending on the particular variety of pessimism, the individual might judge that nothing is really valuable or worth doing or what have you, or they might judge that in the short term they're worth doing or valuable or something like that. But eventually they won't be, and then they often have that preference for the future standard versus the present one. Now, Edwards here again makes a note, right? Why do we use standards? Right? And it seems almost stupid, right? Well, obviously, look, right? They serve a function. They serve some kind of purpose. They help guide our choices, right? We use standards for all sorts of things, and we use them for reasons, right? We set standards to help us distinguish between things, right? If we're trying to sort out, I don't know, it could be all kinds of things. Different grades of fruit and vegetables, right? The standards we use serve some kind of purpose, right? If your standards don't help guide your choices, they aren't good standards because they aren't really serving the function they're supposed to serve. They aren't serving the purpose that we have for them. So when we look at the pessimist standards that have these unusually high standards that value things, according to ultimate or final or what do we want to call it, some point of view at some future time, or some point of view that's larger than our own usual point of view. Edwards says it's just really not clear why we should adopt the pessimist standards, right? Now, again, just as a matter of psychological fact, right? Some people might, right? And recognizing that eventually we're going to die, or say, coming to give up on religious beliefs or something and falling into a kind of despair or existential funk, people might come to adopt those pessimistic standards, at least for a time, right? They might feel just compelled to adopt them for the rest of their lives. Someone like Tolstoy, say. But do you have a reason to adopt them? Do we have a reason to regard those as the correct standards versus other sorts of standards? Edwards says no, right? There's no good reason to adopt them. And in fact, there's good reason not to adopt them. Because when we adopt those standards, they actually don't help us make choices anymore. The choices they seem to point us toward are in fact choices that most pessimists themselves don't make. So for instance, the pessimistic view that death is better than life Edwards says, well, if we look at people like Darrow and Schopenhauer, they don't kill themselves. They go on living and saying, oh, it'd be better to be dead, to not exist, and so on and so forth. But they themselves then don't act on what their standards tell them. So their standards aren't helping them make choices, right? So their standards aren't serving the function good standards are supposed to. So really, if we think about them in practical terms, think about standards in practical terms. Edwards says we have really good reason not to adopt the standards of the pessimists because they always give us the same answer, right? Well, ultimately nothing's going to matter if God doesn't exist, or, right, well, in a million years, that's not going to be valuable, so it's not valuable now. He says, right, that doesn't help us actually make choices or do anything now. All that seems to point towards is really an encouragement to kill yourself, right? Well, nothing matters, nothing's valuable, so you might as well just end it, which pessimists don't do. So if they aren't actually using their own standards, right, and they're the ones advocating for them, it's really not clear why anybody other than them should use their standards. In fact, it's not clear why, in fact, they should advocate for those standards at all, unless what they're doing is really just trying to share their own emotions or their own point of view or something like that. That might be what they're doing, but if that's what they're doing, then they aren't communicating it well, because what they seem to be doing, Edwards is saying, precisely, is trying to put forward their views as, in some sense, being objectively correct, right? Being correct, not just for them, but for everybody. All right, coming around to basically one final point. Is the universe better with or without human life? Right? So one last point the pessimists often make, it would be better for human life not to exist, right? Somehow or other. Here again, Edwards is just really not quite sure exactly what we're supposed to do with what the pessimist is saying here, because there's really no clear objective meaning or sense of better in this case, right? It seems like really what the pessimist is trying to do is elicit our preference, our reaction, right? How we feel about it, right? Do we think or do we feel the universe would be better without human life, right? What's our own attitude towards the existence of humans? That seems to be what the pessimist is really seeking for here, not some sort of objectively correct value judgment about whether or not humans existing make the universe, in some sense, better. Edwards has another sort of nice little comment on this. He says, there's perhaps something a trifle absurd and obsessive in the need for a proof that the existence of life is better than its non-existence. It resembles the demand to have it established by argument that love is better than hate. Right? So it's really not necessary to ask for a set of reasons about, whether or not it's a good thing for humans in general to exist. Right? If it's something that we accept and we enjoy, that's really it. As Edwards is getting at. Right? This is really a matter of feeling, not ultimately of argument. Okay, so summing up, and again, Edwards has a nice list of his own conclusions, but it's a little bit different than what's on this list, and it's worth consulting at the end of his piece, certainly. So just a little wrap up of what I've been saying here. Edwards suggests that the pessimists tell us that the inevitability of death nullifies the value of anything in life, right? And that really death is somehow preferable to life. The future is more important than the present. The past has no value whatsoever. The lack of a final or ultimate meaning or value makes all other things meaning or valueless. The lack of cosmic meaning eliminates the possibility of terrestrial meaning, and it would be better for human life to not exist. So this is really a summary of the claims that Edwards makes about the pessimists. Edwards himself, again, he's got all those sub-conclusions basically on all those particular points he thinks the pessimists are wrong. On a more general level, Edwards concludes that the pessimistic assessment of life provides no objective reasons to support its conclusion. Two sort of subnotes here. Really, there's no reason, Edwards thinks, why we should think that our lives cannot have meaning or value. Even though the pessimists are right that there's going to be suffering and pain and unhappiness and disappointment in any human life, that doesn't mean it is necessarily meaningless or valueless. But this is going to be a matter of preference, right? There's no guarantee, and Edwards himself sort of takes a little bit of a pot shot at things like self-help literature, positive thinking movements. We can think more contemporary terms, fixations on wellness and mindfulness and all these sorts of things. Now, this is not to say that there's nothing worthwhile or interesting in any of that. But what Edwards is getting at, and the point he makes, is that there seems to be a lot of, in some sense, denial that goes into a lot of that sort of stuff, a lot of things like self-help literature, simply trying to deny the facts of disappointment and pain and misery and suffering and so on. Rather, a more healthy attitude is to accept the fact that those things exist and that any human life is going to have them, and then really to look and judge and ultimately feel whether or not things on balance are worth doing, whether or not life is worth living. Right? And he says there's no guarantee for that. Right? So that's his first point. Right? The pessimists really haven't given us any reason to believe their own conclusion. So it's going to be a matter of preference, not argument, whether or not we think our lives are meaningful. Secondly, we don't require cosmic meaning for terrestrial meaning. That is, we don't have to adopt a theistic response to this question of the meaning of life. Even if God doesn't exist, even if we aren't immortal, we can set ourselves goals to pursue, and those can make our lives worth living. And there again, it's really going to be a matter of, in some sense, choice and subjective preference, right, about whether or not that's going to be the case. So we can judge the worthwhileness of lives, we can think in terms of meaning, right, whether or not individuals had goals they were pursuing, or whether or not those goals seem to make their lives go better or be more sort of enticing and worth living to the individual. We can then also judge it from a moral standpoint, right, intersubjectively, thinking in human terms. Was it really good that that human led the life they did and pursued the goals they did? Well, the answer might be yes, might be no. And so Edwards says there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being able to say some human lives are meaningful and worth living, others aren't, right? Some others aren't because of the choices people make. Some others aren't because of, right, factors outside of the choice or control of the individuals leading them, which is just an unfortunate truth. So I'll go ahead and leave the Edwards piece there. I think I've taken quite long enough to get through it. I'll be back tomorrow with a lecture on E.D. Klemke, so one of the original editor of our text, who himself has a piece right in here. So we'll take a look at that tomorrow as a response to theistic views. Hope you're having a good Monday, and I'll see you later. Bye for now.